The 19th century is ebbing away. In the heart of Europe, old dynasties hold on to power. It's a stable, certain, but unequal world. Most ordinary people still accept that it's their place to toil and not to share, to serve and not to question. All that is about to change. A 17-year-old Russian boy saw the 20th century begin.
There were fireworks. There was drinking. There were crowds on the streets. Nobody stayed at home. People started hugging, kissing, making friends and making resolutions. We had huge hopes.
In the new century, some of those hopes were dashed, and many were realized. For millions, there was spiraling danger and cruel abuse. But political power shifted, new freedoms were won, and millions lived longer, healthier, and more prosperous lives than they'd ever expected. This series is the story of those turbulent changes, told by the people themselves.
In my century, we've had electricity, trams, cars, right up to astronauts. This is all my century. It's been fascinating. I'm very pleased with my century.
In 1900, people in the great cities of the West were proud of their achievements and confident of their future. There was rivalry between the European nations, but through careful diplomacy, they'd avoided war for 30 years. And on both sides of the Atlantic, most assumed this peaceful stability would continue.
I would say you had the feeling, well, this is the way it is, this is the way it will always be. Why would it be different? I never dreamed the world would change the way it did.
The Great Paris Exhibition of 1900 symbolized the hopes of the new century. It drew over 50 million visitors. People believed nations could now compete peacefully and avoid war. Education would reach the masses. Science would transform life at work and at home. Arriving by steam train and horse-drawn bus, visitors could make their way round the exhibition on the newest forms of transport.
Je me souviens très bien de l'exposition de 1900.
I remember the 1900 exhibition. I was 6 years old. I saw these people moving forwards without walking, and it puzzled me. So I asked my mother, and she told me it was a moving pavement, the first ever.
C'est le premier trottoir roulant qui existe. Alors ça m'intéresse.
I thought it was really interesting, and I remember it to this day.
Jusque maintenant.
The ingenious pavement swept people to huge pavilions where nations competed to show off their industrial might. Britain brought the heavy engineering that had made her the leading industrial power for so long. The Germans exhibited their latest machine tools and cars. The United States displayed the growing wealth of the new world power that was now overtaking Europe. Her production efficiency was driving up wages to make American workers the envy of the world. One building was a temple to the energy expected to power the new century. It drew enormous crowds, amongst them Raymond Abescal.
At home we used oil lamps and candles. We didn't have electricity. So here was this whole exhibit devoted to electricity. It was wonderful to see the building all lit up in the evening.
A new piece of music, Waltz of the Lights, was played in electricity's honor. And in Paris in 1900, many had their first sight of the new invention that would transform popular entertainment. Moving pictures in color. The exhibition was held at a time of growing prosperity for many, but not for all.
La Belle Époque, c'était pour les riches.
The Belle Époque was for the rich, people who could dress well and eat well, while your workers got nothing but stewed grease and gristle. It wasn't the Belle Époque for everybody.
C'était pas la Belle Époque pour tout le monde.
Further down the Seine, the poor were occupied with the effort of daily survival. Average life expectancy was 46. Families had to fend for themselves. If they were homeless or out of work, they received no help from the state. The world was a less crowded place. Its population would grow 4 times over in the next 100 years. And most still lived on the land, working in drudgery. The United States, with its modern technology and thrusting capitalism, was well down the road that would lead it to dominate the century. Wealth was rippling out to people who were more educated and mobile than any before. New types of jobs were being done by a growing white-collar class. They were the best-paid workers in the world, and advertising persuaded them what to buy. the new choices that had to be made were sometimes baffling.
In 1900, my father was building a house, and one problem was gas and electricity were just coming in to be used generally. So he asked the head of the company which he should put into the house, gas or electricity. And he said, oh, gas, by all means. Electricity is just a fad. It'll never last. So that's what we got.
The spread of electricity brightened lives in every sense. It lit up a new amusement park, the world's largest, built just outside New York at Coney Island. The thrills and excitement were only one of a growing number of ways that people could use their leisure. The mass entertainment that was growing fastest all over the world was cinema. The first films were widely shown in fairground booths. Amy Sears was taken to see one in 1903.
No, I was thrilled to bits. Oh, I said, look at that. And I was sitting on my dad's shoulders, watching it. Yes, that's the one. He just shook it up and put a little on his hand and started rubbing. And then he rubbed again, and a little bit more, and a bit more hair came up, and he just finished up with a lovely head of hair. And I know I was thrilled to bits.
Summer holidays at the coast were a new ritual for many in Europe.
I remember those trains because in 1905 I was 9. This is exactly how it was. All the women in hats. We always wore hats. People got down onto the platform, lots of chatter, and raring to get to the beach just as soon as they possibly could. That was the main thing, to get to the sea. There's a woman with an enormous bathing costume. Look at her. That's exactly how it was. The water's cold there, and the ladies let out little shrieks as they got in. It was very amusing.
And all the time, technology continued to catch the public imagination. In the summer of 1909, Jeanne Plouvin saw history being made on the French coast.
It was quite an event. When we knew that Blériot was going to leave, all of us children in the district, everyone, from the youngest to the oldest, gathered in a field. The corn had been harvested, and so there we stood in this cornfield behind some oil drums, because they didn't let us get too close. It would have been too dangerous.
The first powered flight had been made 6 years before, but no one had yet flown a plane across the Channel. Several had crashed in the sea before Louis Blériot set out from Calais.
C'est un ingénieur, hein? He was an engineer. C'est un monsieur. A gentleman. Very daring, because he knew he was risking his life. Parce qu'il savait qu'il risquait la mort, hein? We heard the engine rumble. He taxied forward, took off gently, and then was gone. Everyone clapped, everyone shouted. We cried, bravo! Bravo!
Blériot's journey began smoothly. But then the wind blew him off course. For 10 anxious minutes he lost sight of all land, before finally glimpsing the English coast. He was waved down onto the cliffs of Dover. Word of Blériot's triumph soon got back to Calais, where Jean Plouvin waited with the crowds.
Blériot a réussi la traversée!
Blériot's made it, they shouted on the street.
Sur les boulevards partout. There
was immense joy when we heard that he'd landed in England. Everyone was happy. It was a victory for France.
Each new achievement of 20th century science was used to boost national prestige. Britain believed it had beaten the world with the largest passenger ship ever made, the Titanic, so advanced that she was said to be unsinkable. But much of the popular faith in experts and engineers was shattered in 1912 on her maiden voyage to New York. Off Newfoundland, the ship struck an iceberg and started to sink. Among the passengers were Benjamin and Esther Hart and their daughter Eva.
My father had put my mother and I into a lifeboat and said to me, "Now be a good girl, hold Mummy's hand," and I thought he was following me. Any child being lifted up and put into a boat like that, you'd think the father was following, but of course he didn't.
The lifeboat pulled clear, and Eva Hart watched as the Titanic went down.
You could hear people screaming. It's a dreadful sound. I remember saying to my mother one time, soon afterwards, about the screams and the shrieks of these people, and I always remember. She said, "Yes, but do you remember the silence that followed it?" And I do. And silence is a great thing to me, because I can remember when there was the whole world and this starlit night and these shrieking, drowning people. I think the worst thing of the lot that was. And then this silence, which you couldn't describe.
Over 1,500 people drowned that night. Most of them were men. It was a case of women and children first. The popular depiction of women was as gilded, frail creatures, pinched at the waist, obedient to their husbands. In the early years of the new century, women began a campaign to change the way they were regarded and win the same political rights as men. Many women were now going out to work in offices and factories. Gertrude Jarrett was a suffragette, fighting for women's votes.
I thought women were equal to men and should have a say in things. I thought that women should have the same rights as men, And it was a woman's life, and she should say what she wanted, whether it was at Parliament or where it was. A woman should have the same say as a man. Several of us that were in the votes for women, we used to get in Hamley Market Square and spout a bit. But in those days, the police would, if they got a bit too rowdy, the police would come and move us off. But we still used to say what we thought.
Arrests, followed by hunger strikes in jail, made the fight increasingly bitter and dangerous. One lone suffragette staged the most extreme protest before the crowds at the Derby in 1913. Emily Davison ducked under the rails and stood in front of the King's horse and was killed. In the West, the most strident challenge came from industrial workers. More and more joined trade unions to fight for higher pay and shorter hours. They no longer accepted that they should work in the old unquestioning way. The unions flexed their muscles in a series of national strikes which became increasingly violent. In France, martial law was introduced after French railway workers had shown they now had the power to bring the whole country to a standstill. Scotland, 1911. A strikebreaker tried to drive his horse and cart through Union pickets, but the crowd was too strong. As a result of the strike, mill girls like Minnie Way were laid off.
That cattle strike went on for 6 weeks. Yes, 6 weeks exact. And they go down the street singing, what was it now? We are out for higher wages, as we have a right to do, but we'll never be content till we get the 10%, for we have a right to live as well as you.
Slowly, people started to win those rights. Governments granted shorter working hours and the first old age pensions. And slowly, across Europe, other changes took effect. New government schools and the mass press sharpened people's sense of their own national identity.